Welcome to the Profile Corner. In today's video we'll be creating a cabinet to be mounted up onto the French Cleat wall back here that's similar to the cabinet that I have next to my drill press. I'll show that on the screen for you now. Essentially the cabinet is going to be 30 inches tall and 18 inches wide, and it'll have two shelves in it. The top and the bottom will be box jointed into the sides, so I should have a very strong joint. And this cabinet is going to be 11¼ inches deep. And that 11¼ inches is very close to the maximum width that I can get at my jointer. So I've got to be very careful how I prepare the boards before they go to the jointer, because many of the boards that I picked out are wider than 11½ inches wide. And so I'll have to cut them down. I'll try a different method today to cut them down than using a handheld circular saw. Okay, so let's head over to where I've got the wood located right now, and we'll take a look at what we'll be dealing with. Okay, so here's the boards that I pulled off my rack that I'll be using. I don't think I'll need all these boards, but I'll need some of them. And some of these boards are quite wide. This one is 15 inches wide at this end and 16 inches at the opposite end. I don't want to waste material, so what I need to do then is to cut a chunk out of the center of this that's about 11½ inches wide, which is about the maximum width that I can get through the jointer. I still have one shelf left over from the last time I created the cabinet. The cabinet was originally supposed to have 3 shelves in it, but I decided to go just with 2 shelves so that I had enough height for the drills to fit in while they're sitting upright. And so I've got part of the material I already need, so I don't need that. But I do need to prepare this wood. I've already gone through it with a metal detector and it did not detect any metal, so that's good. And now I need to brush off any of the boric hair that I can get off the surface so that that's not an abrasive against the cutting knives. And then I'll take this over to the table saw, and I'll be using a jig that came with a contractor's saw that I bought back in the early 1990s when I bought it used. The person was getting rid of that contractor's saw in favor of getting a Powermatic Model 66 saw, and so all the jigs that he had would not fit on his Powermatic 66, so he gave those to me when I bought the table saw. So I think that will allow me to straight line rip this board, and then I can straight line rip it again at 11½ inches, and then I may have some material left over here that I can use for other purposes on other projects, if everything works out right. Okay, so let's head back over to where the table saw is at, and then we'll get started on straight line ripping these boards. Okay, this jig is an 8-foot piece of plywood. It has a runner that goes through the miter gauge slot, and then it has a makeshift clamp at each end, and hopefully that'll hold the board down to a sheet of plywood. Let's go ahead and let's give this a try and see if it works. Well, that seemed to work out perfectly with a 6½ foot long board. So now we've got a straight line rip on the one edge. And what I can do now is I can use the rip fence potentially to get the other edge straight line ripped. Now the next board is ready to be cut. It has a little bit of wane about halfway down the length of the board. Okay, that one worked out perfectly. Okay, this board has a little bit of wane in the middle, probably about 3/4 of an inch or so, and then it has quite a bit of wane, maybe an inch and a quarter, inch and a half at the other end. So this board is going to end up quite narrow once I get done. This board has about a 1/2 inch of wane, roughly halfway down the length of the board. And the last board is mostly straight with very little wane, maybe an 1/8 inch at the most. What I've been doing is using this ruler, and this is the distance from the blade to the edge of the sheet of plywood. And so what I can do is I can just set it up so that I'll get an 1/8 inch overcut, and that should then clean up this edge. So let's give it a shot and see what happens. So now what I need to do then is to cut these down so that they're no more than 11.5 inches wide on the table saw. And I'll probably end up using this jig again so that these boards are stable as they pass over the tabletop of the saw. And I've decided to cut these boards without the assistance of the jig because there wasn't quite enough room for me to be able to use the rip fence. So this first board needs to get cut down to 11 inches wide. That's the maximum width that I can get out of it, and hopefully I get a clean edge here. The next board has quite a bit of bark about halfway down its length, and so I can only get about 8 inches out of this board. This board has quite a bit of bark halfway down its length, so I can only get about 9.5 inches out of this board, even though it's still quite wide right now. For the next board I could get at least 13 inches of width out of it. That won't go through my jointer, so I'll be cutting this one down to 11.5 inches wide. fence where the crosscut table got in the way that time, even though I've got the fence tilted at 45 degrees. So fortunately it didn't cause any kind of a kickback problem. This board would be good for at least 13 inches wide, so I'll be cutting it down to 11 and a half. Okay, now we should be able to head over to the jointer and get one of these faces flat on each of the boards. Okay, the unfortunate thing is that these boards have more than a 1/4 inch warpage from end to end in this direction, all except for one of the boards, so I'll have to cut them roughly halfway in between. I tried to pick the inflection point of the curvature so that I'll be able to straighten these out at the jointer. Okay, let's get started over here at the jointer. And I'm going to head over to the planer, get these boards planed, and then I'll run them through the wide drum sander. I'll do all that off camera. Well, here's the results of all the work that we've done so far. I have several boards here that are a little bit over 11¼ inches wide, so I'll be using these to make the cabinet. This is a leftover board that I had from the last cabinet, so I'll be using that. It has a little bit of cleanup that's needed here, and I can take care of that. That's not a problem. Here's one of the boards for the sides of the cabinet. There's another sideboard, and below that I have the bottom board that's marked out. I can get 18 inches between this bad spot here and the roughness that's down here. On this last board, this section will be used for the top, and this section will be used for the shelf. And then on the other radial arm saw down here, I have all the other boards that were left over. These are all narrower than 11¼ inches. So I'll be using these on other projects that I'll be showing on the channel later on. And I've got quite a number of them that turned out to be clear black walnut, so that should work out real nice for some future projects. So now what I've got to do, I ran one of the edges over the jointer, and the other edge is from the table saw straight line rip. What I need to do though is to run this edge up against the rip fence, and then take this side down so that the board is a little bit over 11¼ inches wide, and then I'll flip the board over and I'll get rid of this jointed edge. The jointed edge is ever so slightly bumpy due to the way the cutter on the jointer works, and so I'll take care of that next over at the table saw. And the fence is set at just under 11 5/16 right now. I've got the edge that went through the jointer on the far side, and so I'll be cutting this inside face first, and then once I get those cut, then I'll set the fence to 11¼ and then I'll run the other edge through the blade to clean up the jointed face. Okay, since I've got the rip profile blade mounted into the table saw right now, and my crosscut sled is not at 90 degrees because I had to shift it so that I could rip down the boards earlier, I'm going to take the boards over to the radial arm saw and cut them to final length now. This first board will be the bottom of the cabinet, and I've got a defect that runs right through here. It has a little bit of a crack at the very bottom of the defect. And so what I've done is I've lined up the cut line with my zero clearance fence with where that crack is at, and so I should be able to get rid of that crack entirely. Okay, it looks like we got rid of the crack, and you saw that the saw tried to auto-feed itself through the cut. And that's because I wasn't holding it back quite enough when it hit this hard spot. Okay, now I need to cut this board to be 18 inches long. 5 that are 13 inches long. And here is exactly, so that's good. Okay, the next board, I've got top marks on it here and shelf down here. And so what I'll do is I'll square up this end first. Okay, now what I'll do is I'll swap ends so then I can use the 0 clearance side of the fence. It needs to be 18 inches wide for the top. And the shelf board needs to be 17¼ inches long. This is one of the sides, so I'll square it in. Now I've got a bad spot down here, so I'm going to square up the other end instead. This board needs to be 30 inches long. Sideboard, so I'll square up the end. Leftover board, supposed to be a shelf. It has to be 17¼ inches long. Right now it's longer than that. Square up one end. Okay, now I need to go over to the dado saw. I currently have a 3/4 inch wide dado stack mounted into the dado saw. And so what I'll do is I'll start out by cutting the dados into the sides to accept the shelves. Now I use the setup block to set the dado stack height to 3/8 of an inch. And this dado stack was already set at 3/4 of an inch wide. This is the dado stack from Woodpeckers. So it has an extremely large center chipper. I use the square to set the outside of the blade to 10 1/4 inches, which according to my plan is the height of this shelf, the top of that shelf. And so now I'm about ready to do the cutting of the dados. I have the boards oriented in the way that I need to have them oriented for being cut. So I'll set this one aside. And now I've got the rip fence set at 10 1/4 inches. I'll be using that in conjunction with this miter gauge. Normally you don't want to do that, but because I'm not making a through cut, there's less of a chance of a kickback, and so I think we'll be okay. To verify that it's 3/8 of an inch deep. It's ever so slightly too shallow. So we'll try the cut again. That's perfect now. Okay, the second shelf needs to be at 21.5 inches tall to the top of it. So I'll set that up once again using the rip fence. Okay, move the miter gauge over to the other miter gauge slot just so that I've got a little bit more support. And now we'll do our next cut. Okay, now I've got to get the saw reconfigured to cut 3/8 inch wide dado cuts for box joints. And I'll have to rebuild the box joint jig, or actually partially create a new box joint jig, because my old box joint jig was set up for the forest blade, and now it cuts a little bit sloppy when I have a dado stack that goes to exactly 3/8 of an inch, as is the case with this one for woodpecker. Now I have the forward fence temporarily clamped onto the back fence with it overlapping the end of the board down here. And so now what I need to do is I need to set up to cut the slot that'll be right here so that I can insert a 3/8 inch wide key, and then I'll slide this fence over 3/4 of an inch essentially, so that it'll be spaced out like this. So I've got the blade roughly 3/4 of an inch above the surface of this board here right now, and I don't have to be super careful with it, just I need to be close to 3/4 of an inch, but not more than 3/4 of an inch. So I'll run the cut through all the way, and that'll create a notch down here, and then I'll have to cut a 3/8 inch wide key that'll fit into here, that's a little bit less than 3/4 of an inch tall. So now I've got to make a 3/8 inch wide key that'll fit into this notch right back here. This box joint jig, by the way, was based on one that I saw on an Ask This Old House episode. If I can find the link to that, I'll include it in the video description. So now what I've got here is a piece of oak that's exactly 3/8 inch wide. I used a 3/8 inch setup block to set the rip fence width on another table saw, and then I cut it so that this board is about 5/8 inch tall. It has to be less than 3/4 of an inch tall if you're going to be using 3/4 inch material. And as you can see here, it just fits into that slot perfectly. Now what I need to do is I need to shift this fence over, but before I do that, I need to glue this key in place. And I don't want to glue it where it's at right now, because I don't want it to glue to this surface. And so what I'll do is I'll remove the two clamps that I have holding the front fence on, and then I can get that glued up so that it doesn't shift out of place. And then I'll need to move this fence over a little bit so that I've got a 3/8 inch gap here, and then of course there's a slot that'll be cut again. So I'll get this piece glued in, and then I'll re-secure this onto the back fence. I've got the 3/8 inch setup block in between the key and the dado blade, so now I know that this position is right. Now what I can do is I can mark on the back side here where I need to cut this board so that it's flush on the ends, and then I can sink some screws in to hold this fence in place. I don't need to cut it to length right now, but I can do that later on. So what I'll do is I'll sink some screws in while this glue is still setting up. Okay, before we cut into the 30-inch long boards for a project, let's try a quick test using these shorter boards. The longer board here will represent the side of the cabinet, and the shorter board will represent either the top or the bottom of the cabinet. And so I'll be using this board later on when we're actually cutting the box joints into the cabinet. So let's get started here. I'm going to mark on this that this is the front. And that this is the front. And I've got to be careful because this dado blade is going to be coming out the back side. I would normally put a block that looks like this glued onto the back side, but I didn't have time to get that glued up. this key. Spin this board around, but the front is pointed this direction and it's on top of the key. Now I need to make sure that I've got the front pointed at the front. Move this piece. Okay, so let's see if this fits together like we're hoping that it will. I've got the dado stack set so that it should be exactly 3/4 of an inch above the surface. Of course, the outside blades here have bat wings, so it makes it a little bit hard to get the setting exactly at 3/4 of an inch. So let's verify here using our setup block. And it looks like I got it on there perfect, or very, very close. Okay, let's see if this fits together. So I think that this will go together. It'll be extremely tight, which means that we'll have good glue surface. Did get a little bit of chip out here, but it looks like that'll work. So we should be able to use it for our project. Now apparently I didn't have the board setting completely down onto the table surface here, and so it did not cut all the way through right there. So I'll have to make sure that I don't have that problem going forward. And what I may do is just ever so slightly sand this down so that there's not quite as much friction. But I'm going to wait for this glue to finish setting up before I do anything else. Yeah, I have the front side marked, and so I've got to make sure that I get that side up against the key. Okay, now I need to cut the top and the bottom pieces. Normally you would use the other piece, in this case a side piece, which would be 30 inches tall, and you set it up like this on the peg, but it's a little bit too tall, so I figured what I would do is just use the sample board instead. I have the side that'll be the front marked on here on tape on both the top and the bottom boards, so now I'll just line it up just like so, and I'll make the first cut on both sides on both boards, and then I'll remove this board. Okay, now I'll take a look at all the fingers to make sure that I have a full depth cut in each one. I'll do that off camera, and if I find any that are not cut all the way down, then I'll fix those before I bring back the camera. And I want to slightly radius the top surface of the bottom and also both of the shelves, and I want to stop about 1 inch before I get to the end of the board. That way I'll have room for the box joints as well as the dado joints. Now I'll do a test assembly of the cabinet. Okay, the dry fit is done. I had to use a steel eye-bar clamp to be able to draw this box joint together in all four corners, so it's a rather tight fit. I'm hoping that I can get it back apart so that I can put some glue into the joints. This shelf down here is real tight as well. This is a shelf that was created for the last cabinet that I built, and so it's a little bit thinner, just by a couple thousandths, and so it fits a little bit loosely into the dados. Okay, so I'm going to get this glued up, and then we'll bring back the camera after that. I ended up using 6 parallel jaw clamps and 2 steel eye-bar clamps to draw this cabinet together. It is square, so that's good to see. I had to use Titebond 3 glue because I needed the extra open time in order to get these joints to close up. So what I'll do is I'll wait about 2 hours, then I'll come out and I'll scrape this glue off just as it's starting to harden. That way it doesn't get smeared into the surface of the wood. And then I'll sand this and then apply a finish to it. I had the finish applied to the cabinet now, and now I'm just installing the French cleat onto the back. These 2 bottom screws are driven in at an angle just to provide a little bit extra strength. And then what I should be able to do is use the same spacer blocks that I used when I was putting up the wall to space out the second French cleat on the back of the cabinet so that it's in the same spacing. And then of course the pointed section needs to point down, and it'll be closest to where the wall's at, so it'll actually be up in this orientation. So I've got it right there. What I'll do is I'll pre-drill for my first screw. Pre-drill for a second screw. And then we can drive in 2 screws. Okay, let's just verify that we've got the French cleat in the right spot down on this end. Here we do. I'll just pre-drill down here. So in theory, this cabinet is ready to be hung up onto the wall. I've knocked a little bit of the sawdust off of it, but I think it'll be okay. So you can see here that this French cleat was held down 3/4 of an inch from the top of the cabinet, so that way the screws did not interfere with the box joints that are up here in the corners. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.